We've gone over at a high level that there are requirements on how to be a good steward of grant dollars. So why is this important and what does this mean for you? So let's look at an example. So why do you have to follow regulations and what happens when you don't? So as I'm going through this example, I want you to think about what are some potential issues that could happen and what best practices and policies weren't followed. So think about reasonable and necessary, allocable, consistent in conformance, and documented as you're reading these. And these are real examples. A lot of what I've shared earlier sounds like common sense, but from what our office has seen and what other people have seen is it doesn't always happen. So while it may sound like common sense, there are very real examples, a lot of multiple examples of things going wrong and consequences. Okay, so county government received a large federal grant to provide social services to low-income families and children. As part of the county program, staff would implement a back-to-school drive for families and hand out items needed in the same target community, such as backpacks. Shortly after the event, county staff received a site visit from the federal program officer. The site visit review of documents revealed that some individuals receiving back-to-school materials were in fact not from the neighborhood, and they were not a part of a low-income household. Okay, so they were giving items to people who weren't eligible for them. What are some potential issues that could happen, and what best practices and policies weren't followed? So the consequence of this real-life example is the county government had to give back a portion of the funding used to cover the back-to-school program. So they had to come out with dollars out of their own pockets to rectify the situation. So what are potential issues that could happen? So additionally, other than giving back a portion of the funds and finding that from somewhere, they could have been found to be non-compliant. They could have had to potentially give back the entire grant portion. If they weren't following procedures, they could have given back the whole thing. If they really push it, they could have been debarred or suspended for misuse of funds. And when you're put on the suspension and debarment list, it means that you are not eligible to receive any federal funding. And so it could have some very serious economic impacts on this organization, and therefore the other organizations, if money needed to be paid back, is taken from like a general fund. So what best practices that weren't followed is they didn't have proper internal controls. They needed to have a policy on how to identify the low-income populations, and they needed to have a procedure on how they're going to properly delegate these backpacks. So how would you fix the situation? If you could go back, there are a couple of options. The first that they could do is they could partner with an organization who serves only low-income participants. So for example, if they partnered with Head Start, who receives their funding based on requirements of income. So you could partner with somebody and subgrant to them to have them give out the backpacks when they're already checking and they already know that their populations and those who are receiving services qualify for the low income. You could also, if you wanted to administer it yourself, is you could identify from the US Census tracts low income zip codes, and you could find high poverty zip codes. And then when the participants or those who were seeking to benefit from this program came in, you could check their license or some kind of ID and make sure that they have the zip code that is in the high poverty area that it checks out. So there are a couple options. You could partner with somebody who does this already, or if you wanted to do it yourself, you could come up with a procedure and use information and data on how to properly check to make sure that those who are taking are properly documented. And again, the county might have been giving out families who were in the low income areas, but since they weren't capturing this properly, they were penalized for that. And so that's why you need to document and to cover yourself that what you're doing is in line with what you said you were going to do. Okay, example number 2. So as I read these, I want you to think about potential issues that could happen and what best practices and policies weren't followed. Okay, a county government had an annual performance contract with a federal agency. The county was awarded supplemental grant funds from the same federal agency to enhance their program for providing staff training. The grant funds had a 12-month project period. Over a 7-month period, county staff failed to meet several deliverables on their annual contract. For example, staff were responsible for closing 10+ cases a month with low-income program participants. During the past year, staff had only closed 6 cases due to the retirement of 1 staff member, and another staff member took an extended medical leave. After a desk audit, the federal agency temporarily suspended the program, offered technical assistance, and suggested a corrective action plan to mitigate program closure. However, the county did not implement any of these suggested actions. So what are potential issues and what practices and policies weren't followed? Okay, so if you look at this is a programmatic issue. I said that there can be fiscal or program findings, and this one was because they were not meeting their program deliverables. So then if you notice in the last paragraph, the federal agency temporarily suspended the program and they offered them technical assistance. So the feds have come in and looked at them and they offered a suggested corrective action plan to which the agency agreed. And so after that corrective action plan, they still didn't meet the requirements. So the consequence of this was the funder suspended the annual contract due to lack of performance, and they rescinded the second grant until further notice. So this could potentially be very impactful in a negative way on this organization. They're not eligible immediately for the second grant, and they're not getting paid for the first contract that they have. So some things that could have been done better is the first thing that they did was they did not notify the federal project officer of key staff changes. And so when that happens, if you're having key staff turnover, you need to let the federal project officer know. In my experience, the federal project officers have been really willing to help and offer guidance where they can. And I've seen them as a partner. And you know, they want to see success in the grant, and of course it's up to you as the awardee to meet the outcomes and to be sure that you're working towards those. But it's also important that you see the federal project officer as a partner and to keep them posted on important things like key personnel, so then maybe they can offer guidance or some kind of support. And again, you know, it's up to you as the awardee to meet the requirements, but do keep the federal project officer informed. Another thing that they could have done is, it sounds like the corrective action plan was something that they weren't able to meet. And so when you are signing a corrective action plan, and hopefully you won't ever have to, but if you do, it's a good faith effort between both parties to try and get the grant back on track. So when you are signing the plan, you need to be sure that it's something that you can do. And if it's not, you need to say so and then work it out with your project officer. And this is important to note that, you know, in the previous example, it was some fiscal examples that they kind of got hung up on. But this is a programmatic component. And so they will look for, you need to be meeting your requirements on both the programmatic side and on the fiscal side. If you're not meeting your deliverables programmatically, you can be in just as much risk and trouble as if it was fiscal as well. Okay, and so this is an example of a Nevada situation. So review the email below and identify potential ramifications this will have for Nevada. So you see this email is what came out from my supervisor at the grant office, discussing that there was an audit by the Office of the Inspector General the year before last. And so the agency who received the findings has been working hard on the corrective action plan, and that's from the example we saw last time. They're put on a corrective action plan. But the findings were then found in the entire state of Nevada's single audit report as an adverse opinion. So it showed up on the entire state of Nevada report. So what we have seen from this is it's come to the attention that the federal agency, the U.S. Department of Justice, has been placing special conditions on all Department of Justice awards to the Nevada state agencies due to the designation of DHHS as a high-risk entity. So this means that the agency was, if any applicant applies from the state of Nevada, there is a high-risk designation. Just because the one agency had the audit findings, the entire state is now designated as high risk. And so potential ramifications for this means that some applicants might not be awarded, even if they weren't the ones with the findings. Some of the federal agencies may not want to award because they see it as too much as a risk, even if it's not the one who's found to be with the findings. They can still not award. They can also not award, or they can place special conditions on awards, whether it's the agency who received the findings or an agency who did not receive the findings, which means they can withhold payments until the deficiencies are corrected. They can disallow all or part of the cost of the activities not in compliance. They can wholly suspend or terminate the federal awards. They can initiate or suspend debarment proceedings. They can withhold further federal funds, or they can not expend certain things. So this has pretty big implications for the entire state. So just one agency can affect many others. And so that's why being vigilant in your monitoring and expenditures is really important. Okay, so what's happened with example 3 is the agency is under a corrective action plan. They are working diligently to correct findings. They attend regular meetings with the auditor, and any agency from Nevada who applies is labeled high risk. So in addition to the consequences of what I shared in the last slide, now program staff is spending a lot of their time attending monthly meetings, working to correct findings. And so in addition to their full-time jobs, they are now needing to fix what has happened. And so it just takes a lot of time in addition to being seen as a risk and putting future funding opportunities at risk. And again, the future funding opportunities mean services to Nevadans. So it's not just that they have to spend a lot of their time trying to fix what has happened, but that could be services lost to people. Okay, so now let's look at a scenario. And what would you do? So your state agency has a grant of $10 million to assist with expanding access to voting. It is a 5-year grant. During a self-assessment in year 4, an agency discovers that as part of the grant award, the funds were to be kept in an interest-bearing account and the accrual of interest was to be used as part of the project costs. Okay, so since there was no interest accrued, your agency has lost over $2 million that must be used to fulfill their program requirements. So in Nevada, what does this mean? What are some scenarios that could happen, and how will you finish the program? How would you get the $2 million? And what resources could have been affected to finish the project that had nothing to do with the program? How did this program become a problem for the state and affect Nevadans? Okay, so what this means is, as part of the total grant award, the original $10 million was supposed to be put in an interest-bearing account. And then for the last year, that money that would have been accrued in the interest was going to project costs. So you are $2 million short to meet the deliverables of the program. What are some scenarios that could happen? Is you could try and find the $2 million. How you would find that would be hard. You could not meet the federal requirements and not meet your program deliverables and be forced to give some or all of the money back because you did not meet the program requirements. So you'd have to give $10 million back, or part of. And you could potentially be disbarred or flagged as high risk and not receive future funding opportunities. You can try and find somebody who would come up either privately or through other avenues to come up with the $2 million. Or if you're in Nevada, you could go to the IFC and take money from the contingency fund, which would mean that you would have to go before the Board of Examiners and explain what had happened, and go before the legislatures and explain what happened. You could do that and then meet the grant requirements, but it would cost quite a bit of time and explaining to do. So this is why it's pivotal that you read from the very beginning the requirements of your grant that you set up. And I would have a pre-meeting before you go on with all of the stakeholders. You would create a plan of how you're going to be delivering these year to year, and that all requirements are met. So it's very important that you are knowing what you're doing from the beginning, asking questions if you don't know, and that you're meeting these, because all of these previous examples that I've given are real life scenarios and they actually happened. Again, while it may sound like common sense, these things have happened and they happen regularly. So always think reasonable and necessary, allocable, conformance and consistent, and documented. And be sure that you read, and read again your grant requirements. Okay, so to recap, if you have a grant, you are responsible for having policies and following regulations and best practices. There will be some resources where to find these following. Good stewardship of grant dollars impacts Nevadans and communities. Remember that these are services that are given to people, and misappropriation can mean lost opioid treatment, lost preschool opportunities, being able to take from the contingency fund, and failure to adhere to these can cost citizens immediately and in the future. Immediately, and if you need to give back federal grant dollars, or in the future if we're missing opportunities because the federal agencies won't fund us because of past mistakes. Okay, and some resources on where you can find further information. grants.gov. They have YouTube tutorials on how to operate their websites, their workspace. They have a blog on best practices, how to write good applications, how to manage properly. FFIS, they have funding opportunities and they show where money goes to in Nevada. Your federal agency newsletters, like for example, the Federal Department of Education, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Justice, they have newsletters that they will send out all the time, highlighting awarded grant programs, discussing what's important to them, discussing future funding opportunities. And these are really good to read to see what they are interested in. So when you are writing an application, you can write competitively to it. And you can also find other organizations across the country who are managing in areas that you are interested in. There's a Natural Grants Management Association. It's best practices for grant professionals. They have trainings you can buy. It's a subscription, but they offer some really good trainings and networking opportunities to discuss with other grant professionals. There's the Grant Professional Association, which does the same thing. The State Grant Work Group that the Nevada Grant Office operates, that we would be happy to have you in if you're a grant professional. There's a link to the Division of Internal Audit and the Self-Assessment Questionnaire. These are your agency needs to be making sure that you're checking yes to all the boxes. And then there's the grants.nme.gov, the State of Nevada Grant Office website that again has a Nevada Grant Manual and forms. Remember, the Grants Office is here to help. Please do not ever hesitate to contact us if you have any questions or need further information. We have access to a lot of resources, and so if you have specific topic questions, we can find you good resources on that. If you're interested in further training, we also have access to that. And then there is a grant conference likely in January of 2021 that will be for the state of Nevada and will bring together presenters, panels, and best practices. So we'll keep you informed on that as that shapes up and as we get more information. Again, here is my contact information. I'm Erin Hasty. I'm looking forward to working with you and answering any questions you may have. Thank you.